welcome all. We are thrilled to have you for our conversation on embracing longevity, a conversation with President and CEO of Next 50, Peter Kaldes. We are grateful to have you here, Peter. For those of you who I don't know in our group, my name is Seth Green, and I'm the Dean of the Graham School here at the University of Chicago. And I'm thrilled to welcome you to our wintry campus, although there's not actual snow on the ground right now. So take that as an aspiration as we move toward the holidays. And I'll just share a few reminders before we jump into a wonderful conversation. We are currently in winter registration mode with more than 70 courses that are up on our catalog for those who want to dive deep into learning early in the new year. We also have many other exciting upcoming events over this month. We have our First Friday lecture tomorrow that will look at Plato's Meno. We have a conversation on Monday with neuroscientist Daniel Levitin, who looks a lot at similar issues related to longevity, although looks at them from a fascinating perspective as a neuroscientist who looks at the power and healing nature of music. And then later next week, we will have our Study in Greece information session. Most importantly, we have our holiday party coming up, and we have over 300 people who are coming from across our school. So please join us and be among us. We also have, just before the holiday party, a fabulous discussion with Graham School instructor Lynn Apnip, who has just published a new book that looks at the big questions in American literature, from tragedy to apocalypse. And I'll just share that if you join us for our holiday party, you will get to see our presentation of our 2024 Excellence in Teaching Awards, which this year will be going to Fred Beitler and Austin Walker. But the reason that you are here is for a conversation with Peter Kaldes. And so let me highlight Peter. Hello, Peter. Welcome. We're thrilled to have you here.
Thanks, Seth. Thanks for having me.
So Peter is an extraordinarily accomplished leader. He is currently president and CEO of Next 50, which he'll talk about during this conversation. Prior to this role, he was the president and CEO of the American Society on Aging, the nation's largest association of diverse professionals in the field of aging. He helped successfully navigate that organization through an unprecedented pandemic, innovated its brand identity and programming, including launching ASA Rise, a social justice and leadership academy for rising leaders of color, and increased ASA's membership by 35%. He also has served in the White House as an economic policy advisor to President Barack Obama and as an executive at JP Morgan. And today, Peter, as we talked about, you are a leader in the field of aging, but you really have come to this space organically. And we talked in advance of this and you shared your story, but I thought that'd be a great way to start our conversation here. If you could talk a little bit about what led you to become interested in aging when you were coming from a background looking at economic development and thinking about some of these community economic development topics. How did you become interested in aging? And then a little bit about your experience over the last decade now in this field.
Yeah, Seth, thank you for that introduction, and I'm delighted to be on this call with all of you. Well, yeah, I started life as a lawyer, I like to joke, and the kind of law I practiced is not at all related to what I do now. I was an international trade attorney working in government and in the private sector and did that for about a decade. And basically, I was helping companies bring products into this country. So I'm intimately familiar with the tariff discussion that's going on right now nationally. And after doing very sort of DC things, practicing law, I had the opportunity to do something else that was very DC, and that is work in Congress and in the Obama administration, where what I thought was irrelevant was actually quite relevant, because at the end of the day, what we were trying to do in the administration at the time was grow jobs through exporting. And those kinds of economic opportunities for policy impact just resonated with me. And I carried that with me to JP Morgan, where I led a similar sort of initiative that Jamie Dimon had. Ultimately, my husband moved us to South Florida, where I thought, okay, what's next? And just by happenstance, landed leading an organization known as the South Florida Institute on Aging. So I like to joke that I spent 4 years earning my bachelor's in aging at the local grassroots level, running a community-based organization. Um, and that sort of brought me to the last 10 years of being in aging. And to me, the field is very much both exciting and sclerotic at the same time. And it's that sort of opportunity that I thrive on. And it's been very interesting to see the sort of wild, wild west, if you will, of opportunity and aging unfold this last decade. And we're playing a small part in it.
Well, let's jump into that conversation. We are living through what has been described as a longevity revolution, and we'll talk about how that revolution has been very inequitable in nature. But just to lay the table, Peter, can you talk about how you would describe the big changes in longevity over recent decades?
Well, I mean, it starts with the obvious. We're living longer, right? And it's not just us in the US. You know, by some math, by as soon as 2029, there will be more people over the age of 65 than under 18 in this country. But it's a global phenomenon. The world is aging, and countries are dealing with the issues facing societies with an aging society. And so at Next 50, as a private national foundation, we sort of look at the opportunity through four pretty specific principles. And that is to say, if you do these four things right, we think aging can be improved. The systems around aging can be improved. So one of those is looking at economic opportunity. It's sort of the core of our grant making. How do we ensure there's affordable housing, access to transportation, that we reduce poverty? But we also look at a second priority known as the built environment. When you think about neighborhood and physical spaces, you think about outdoor spaces, recreation, but also this is where we consider sustainable cities and communities as a focus. You can't talk about aging without talking about health. And obviously that includes nutrition and health services and long-term care and mental well-being. And finally, that's very much tied to our fourth principle, which is social inclusion. And not just in the social isolation sense that we get more isolated as we age, but also in the civic participation sense, in the multi-generational learning sense, and of course in equality and reducing inequity. So we really look at four key principles: economic opportunity, the built environment, health, and social inclusion.
Well, so I want to dig into your comment that this is changing society. So you made the case and gave us data around the changing in our lifespans. And then you've given us some really powerful themes in terms of what it takes to build a world that is healthy for aging. Can you talk a bit about how the longevity is changing the nature of our society? And you began to, I think, give us a glimpse into that when you said there will be in a decade, right, or actually 5 years, 2029, more people over 65 than under 18, right? That is a dramatically different world. Just to think about it, you know, we've used to think about the big resource intensity as how do we educate these young people? And we'll be in a world where, from a math perspective, the group at the other side, so to speak, is actually greater, which is, you know, an amazing idea from at least where I started in this world and how I thought about lifespan and cycle.
So the change, you know, I think there's doom and gloomers, and then there are those people who, like me and those of us at Next 50, see this as an opportunity. So let's just start with the doom and gloomers, as I like to call them. These are the folks that believe, and there's science, there's some data behind this, but believe that an aging society reduces investment in capital flow. It increases healthcare spending, and reduces individuals' ability to spend on other things to be a strong consumer. That somehow societies with an aging population will see their capital flow out of their country and into younger populations or countries with younger populations. But I have to say, that is probably data-driven and true. And it is also true that's operating under the assumption that those consumers aren't one of the wealthiest consumers we've ever seen. It also assumes that those folks don't want to work longer. It also assumes that they aren't going to be productive in working or want to work. So it requires us to be more optimistic and requires us to sort of change our thinking around aging. And universities like Oxford and the London School of Economics and Harvard and other organizations like AARP and the International Monetary Fund all have done really robust studies to actually demonstrate the positive economic effects of an aging society. And we're already seeing some of that happen this last decade. So, for example, earlier we did see lower interest rates as a result of some of an aging population. We did see that more people are working longer. In fact, one of the fastest growing populations who are working longer are those over the age of 70. And so I think we're seeing a lot of structural changes, but we're very ill prepared for them.
Well, so one other topic I want to make sure I lay on the table, and then we're going to talk a bit about how we think about this as a society and then how we approach this individually. But I want to lay on the table the inequities in aging, because this is a big focus of yours. We have a number of initiatives at the University of Chicago with a largely focus on individuals who have had great accomplishment and are thinking about how they have a really meaningful next chapter. And we're very focused on how do we activate that extraordinary talent. And we're incredibly proud of how that benefits society. But another topic that we think about, even though we haven't acted as much in our direct work with the Leadership in Society initiative, is the big divide that currently exists in aging. And we see it in income, we see it in health span. Can you just, I mean, it's very sobering. We talked about some of this. You've reported on it as a foundation. Can you give us a picture of what that inequity looks like and how it has grown in the last few decades in terms of what's happening in our aging population?
Yeah, it's not going to be a surprise to anyone on this Zoom that it's very expensive to get old in this country. And when I say that, some people chuckle, and I wish it were a joke, because when you think about it, more than 30% of older adults in the US are classified as economically insecure. So a third. And to be even more specific about it, when you look at economic insecurity amongst marginalized populations, so think about the Black community, the Hispanic community, in each of those cases, over 44% of Black older adults, over 44% of Hispanic older adults have incomes that are 200% of the federal poverty level. In other words, average incomes of about $25,000 a year. These are people who are living exclusively on Social Security in many respects, and some don't even have enough to do that. So we see this as a cultural imperative, because we're going to have more people who are falling into this economically insecure category by the mere nature that we have more people aging in this country. There's some great tools out there as well that demonstrate this. There's the Elder Index over at the University of Massachusetts in Boston that really does a great job of classifying and documenting this devastating aspect to aging, this costliness to aging. And then, of course, this cuts across other demographics as well. So the way we look at it is we're mandated by our mission to look at marginalized populations. And we define those not just racially or ethnically, but also geographically diverse. In Colorado, for example, we have rural and frontier areas, but we also look at the disability community. We look at veterans and the LGBTQ plus community. These are all historically marginalized or geographically isolated communities. So in our work, we have to, because of our mission, focus on these marginalized populations for our funding. And I say that because we were born out of a healthcare conversion, which, to get into the weeds just for a minute, we were a healthcare system, a nonprofit healthcare system for low and middle income older adults known as PACE. And a private equity firm bought that. And as part of that transaction, the attorney general said, hold on, you are likely, you may not be serving, you private equity firm may not be serving this population anymore because you may not be making money off of them. So we're going to put proceeds of this transaction aside and start the Next 50 Foundation. So that's why we're so focused on breaking down inequities. It's literally in our DNA.
Well, so I want to cover one more area, and then I want to turn to individuals because you look at how individuals can embrace longevity as well. We've kind of talked about how longevity is really revolutionizing our world, what some of the challenges that may present, and then the inequities. I want to lay one more piece out and then really move into the solution side, and that is ageism is another thing that you look at. And, to come back to some of the things you mentioned earlier, right, there can be a sense that this is a real burden on a society to age, that there is a inevitable decline, that people don't have the ability to be productive members of community, right? Those are all myths about this process. Can you talk a little bit about ageism, which in some ways underpins it, but then I want to especially begin to pivot towards some of the solutions that you're involved in, because I think what you're doing with New York City schools is a really interesting example for all of us to be thinking about, which is really to try to look at an intergenerational approach to how we overcome this sense of ageism. So just want to lay that on the table as well, Peter. Can you talk about how you think of ageism and then also what you're doing with New York City schools as a pilot right now?
So for us, ending ageism is a way to create economic opportunity. It's that simple for us. And so how do you end ageism? Well, you have to demonstrate that there's value in aging. If you value something, you prioritize it. And so when you think about our lives and think about us as individuals, how are we not valued as we age? I mean, from as early as elementary school, we're programmed to mock ourselves as we get older. There are schools, public schools, that have on their 100th day of class, they force their children to come in dressed as 100 years old, wearing wigs and walking in canes. And so, from an early age, while they're learning their basic math skills, they're also learning that we should mock ourselves as we age. And if you take that throughout the life course, think about, as you reach your mid-50s in the work environment, you start getting asked when you plan on retiring. Well, since when is a chronological point in your life trigger some sort of sense that you no longer want to be generative or productive as we age? And it's funny because my parents are Greek, and so I often joke that I blame my heritage for these notions of older adults being a burden on society. The Byzantine Empire was the first to sort of think of it through that lens. And then you fast forward and you think about retirement and how the mere notion of it is ageist, that somehow you have no value because you've reached 62 or 72 or 82. And so for us, if you value it, if you value aging, then we think we can end ageism and really change the last sort of acceptable ism, if you will.
Well, and can you talk a little bit about the New York City experiment? Because I think it's an interesting one.
Yeah. So one of our priority areas in funding is looking at how we end ageism. So we get all sorts of fascinating ideas around media partnerships. We collaborate with the Gina Davis Institute, with Bradley Cooper's One Family Foundation. But an interesting opportunity came up with the New York City Department of Aging, the New York City Public School System, and the New York Academy of Medicine, NIAM, they came to us and said, we're not going to change ageism unless we start earlier. So they proposed a anti-ageism curriculum that would be included in K through 12 education. And they designed it in a way that wasn't separate from the existing material that the Department of Education requires New York to teach, but actually was additive to demonstrate how we are being ageist. And so this is going to, we just announced this grant just last week. It's a little over $350,000 over the next 3 years to actually have teachers change how students view aging. And so we're really excited about this pilot project.
Well, so I want to begin to shift to individuals, Peter, because, another piece of the work is really thinking about what this longevity means in individuals' lives and at different stages. And so can you talk a little bit about some of the research and work that you've done both at Next 50, but also through the ASA around how individuals really can embrace the power of longevity?
So there's a couple of ways, right? So first, I think at a very basic level, it's making consumer decisions that hopefully, if we all take, people will pay attention to. So for example, simple little things. What about instead of, I don't know, making fun of your age, you actually started celebrating your age by buying, basic birthday cards that celebrate aging? Small things. What if you started, paying attention to mobility and going back to the gym and taking care of yourself because science has demonstrated that just a little more protein and a little more weightlifting can actually expand your life. And while you're looking to expand your life, why not be happier and have a positive outlook on aging, which, as you know, Seth, those with science has shown, those with a positive view on aging tend to live about 7.5 years longer than those who don't, who have a negative view of aging. I think those are really small individual things, but on a larger scale, I think individuals that are about to perhaps consider leaving the workforce or are being forced to retire, how about having those difficult conversations with the HR departments of your employer and say, look, if you just retrain me or see the value I have in transitioning new staff, or you put me on a consulting arrangement, I still have value and I can still be productive, and I've been demonstrated to be loyal to your employer or to the work. I think if more people advocate for themselves in the workplace, I think you'll start seeing a little more change of heart, particularly as we are getting into this space of unemployment where jobs aren't being filled and it's a tight labor market. And who can we turn to? Oh, I don't know, experienced workers. So those are some small ways that individuals can make changes.
Yeah, and there are obviously interplays between the society and the individual lanes because, on that one, I think we're beginning to see some of the rigidities that have long held back a more dynamic workplace change. Remote work, also flexible hours in terms of, I've seen increasing reliance on potentially having more flexibility added in so that people can take an off ramp rather than have a cliff. So I think we're seeing interplays between individuals asking, but then a number of changes structurally that are opening up these possibilities. And certainly there's a lot more to come because, as you described, there are less 18-year-olds and under. So at the same time as we're aging, we're also seeing, lower levels of fertility, right? And those are going to interplay in a way that, I think will cause some significant questions in how we handle the labor market long term. And likely, as necessity is the parent of innovation, lead to some significant innovations that might be a win-win. I want to come to the questions that are beginning to populate the chat. Let me just ask you a personal question, Peter. You are now in this for 10 years. How has being a part of the aging field and the big conversations, how has that changed you and your lifestyle choices as someone who I believe may still be beyond, in midlife. So how is it kind of changing you now and changing your outlook?
Well, I've become that annoying advocate. When I talk to my parents and they say, "Oh, I'm too old to do this," I'm like, "You're what? Why? No, no, no! Stop thinking that way." I'm that annoying family member now. Personally, also, I am more mindful of. I mentioned protein earlier, of my diet. I am
Yeah.
more mindful of the way I work out is more about functional routines rather than aesthetic, because I want to be able to, pick up my nieces when I'm older. So I think there are a lot of little ways that if I think about them, um, oh, I guess here's another one. Is sort of as you age, you sort of recognize there are things beyond your control, including the fact that this is never going to grow back again, and that I need to be okay with it. And so I think there's a lot of wisdom that comes with aging that I think if we celebrate more, we'll be able to all just, I think, accept that aging is not a bad thing.
Well, I do think, and I want to then come to the chat, that there's a really interesting experience for me interacting now with a lot of the people who come here for this next chapter discernment to realize how vital these other pieces, well beyond your career, your relationships, your health. I mean, I've heard people say, yes, your 401k is important, but people misfocus on their blood pressure, their muscle, all of these other pieces. And there is a group, I realize there's a big group without that 401k development. There's also a group, they have the 401ks, but don't have the full health span to be able to enjoy it. And so having that holistic picture, I think you quickly realize is so vital. And in our, I think, midlife, we can get very focused on a singular goal. And it begins to draw you back into the whole, I think, very quickly as you talk to people and come to these recognitions. All right, let me come to the chat. Hubert says, digital divide is a challenge with aging, especially when longevity in careers and social interactions must cope with acceleration in digital innovation. I'll add to this comment that we are obviously on the cusp of an even greater revolution than we've ever seen in our lifetimes with AI. And the question out of this, Peter, is how should we handle this digital divide?
We should run into the fire. We should not run away from this. That's how we handle it. So let me be more specific. At Next 50, and I suspect in many of your communities, there are nonprofit organizations that are engaging with what we call digital literacy, where there are free to low cost classes that we fund that support not just how to use a phone, but how to really adopt AI, how to work technology so it makes your life easier and better. So that's one answer. A second, more macro, is to pay attention to what's going on in Washington. Right now, under the Biden administration, millions and millions of dollars have been pushed out to the states and to localities to support broadband, to support digital expansion and digital literacy. And there are more and more opportunities that come out of really thoughtful legislation that supports investing in older adults and their digital literacy. And finally, I'm going to the Consumer Electronics Show in January. Age Tech, as it's so called, is a space to watch. Every year, there are some amazing technologies that are coming out that are making it easier for you to provide and receive caregiving, for you to get the kind of home care assistance you may need, and also to be retrained on certain skills to re-enter the workforce if you're so inclined.
Mario Bravo writes, these are interesting US-centric ideas, but can you give us some examples at the global level? Some 2 or 3 countries that are advanced in dealing with longevity, ageism, and demonstrating value on experienced workforces, even being 60 to 7-year elders. So yeah, can you talk about, as you do your work, are there other countries that you see that could be role models for us and that can offer examples that we might be able to bring here and converge to some of their best practices?
So I sit on Help Age International's board. It's a global NGO, and they are sort of like an Oxfam for older adults. And what's fascinating is those countries that you think would be doing it right aren't the obvious ones. So, for example, Japan, in Germany, and South Korea are often cited as the leaders of societies that are aging the fastest, yet they're not the ones with the most innovative solutions. If you go to Vietnam, for example, they have created community-based OPAs, or older persons associations, where it's sort of like these councils of elders, where the needs of the community are brought there and they become advocates in the community, whether it's for affordable housing, for jobs, for cleaning up the streets, pollution. It's fascinating. It's absolutely fascinating. India, I was just in India, in Kerala, as a matter of fact, where a similar sort of model is taking place, but it's multi-generational in scope. They have daycare centers for adults, but also for children. And they collaborate on all sorts of projects and work and places to be and spend your time. So I actually think we should look to the global South, not just industrialized nations, for really good and thoughtful ideas around aging.
Len Rothman writes, I heard that the blue zones have been debunked. Your understanding, question mark. Yeah, what are your thoughts if you're familiar with the blue zone movement? How do you think about that? And maybe I'll broaden this question a little bit because there's a whole world now, and this is kind of in that tech billionaire group of people that are really trying to achieve extraordinary aging outcomes. Living forever is the dream of a subset. How do you think about blue zones? But then we'll also add on this kind of other movement that at least you see visibly. I don't know how broad it is in actual population of people that are trying to bring all of these ideas together and then maximize at a level that at least to date has never been done in terms of, human potential longevity.
Yeah. So I'm going to preface this by saying I am not a medical doctor. I'm a recovering attorney. However, I will say that the blue zones, and as someone who's of Greek descent, I have seen firsthand in my own life and my own family tree the power of the Mediterranean diet and the power of having purpose and exercise and eating well. I mean, to put it simply, and the blue zones are nothing but that. With all respect to blanking on the blue zone doctor's name, but
Yeah,
it is definitely science to back the combination of key ingredients in one's diet and exercise and community and purpose leads to longevity. Now, yes, there are billionaires who are looking to make that longevity longer by taking a pill or by taking thousands of pills to live to be 200. And to that, I'd say, knock yourselves out. Innovate, innovate, innovate. But what's going to happen to those people who are 100 and 150? And we can't feed and house the people we have now. How about thinking through innovative aging communities for all these people that are going to live longer? That's how I'd like to see some of those billions being spent on their innovations.
There's a question here about guidelines for diet and exercise. I realize, again, you're not a medical doctor, but this topic of longevity evokes natural questions. And you've already mentioned a few of them in terms of, protein and muscle mass, which declines naturally as you age. And so you need to be extra proactive. And, it's against the way that we think about life, but you actually need to lift weights more as you age than less. We think about the young bodybuilder, not the old one. And of course, I read Peter Attia's work and immediately that changed my outlook and finally got me back into some of these practices that I had long been away from. Can you just talk about any additional guidance you would give on that front?
Yeah, I'm gonna touch on something that people, I think, still ignore despite having gone through COVID. And that is social connectedness. We have to focus on community, and whether it's making that extra effort to go to your synagogue or to your church regularly, whether that is being more intentional about picking up the phone and annoying your grandkids, whether that means simply volunteering in your community to help others or with children, we cannot ignore that our well-being is informed by our social connectedness. So I would strongly encourage, in addition to preventing sarcopenia or muscle mass loss, in addition to preventing diabetes, in addition to all the sort of other conditions that happen as we age, I would encourage all of us to focus equally on social connectedness.
We have another question here from Dorothea Jewell about the not insignificant challenges of the dementias. And maybe we can broaden that into the, very real challenge that does sometimes come. I know we're very importantly describing that it is not about aging alone, in the sense, when people said, oh, this person's too old to be president or a leader, I would always say, well, what do you think about Anthony Fauci? Because he led us through COVID, and, he was in his 80s when he did it. And I don't think anyone would call him low energy or lacking in insight, even if maybe they disagreed with the recommendation. And so it's not about aging, but there is a correlation where aging and some of these issues that come up become more pronounced. How do you think we approach those really meaningful challenges as a society?
So this is a bit of an unpopular opinion, but I'll share it for the purpose of our conversation. The dementia and all the various forms, and Alzheimer's and all its various forms, is on the rise. There is no question about that. What's also true is that those fighting for it have extraordinary money and influence in informing our views, not just about the disease, but about aging. And I think as a result of their extraordinary power and true advocacy, a side effect of it has been to get us thinking about aging and dementia as if they're one and the same, as if just because we're aging, we lose acuity, and while it's true for a small number of us, it's not the norm. And so I like what you were saying, Seth, about fitness to lead. Do you have the leadership skills, the ideas, all of it? Not just assume that because you are 80, you can no longer string together a sentence. And I think that's what's happened as a result of the really strong, powerful fundraising efforts of some of these leading national organizations that have raised great awareness around these awful, awful, awful diseases.
Well, and just to validate your point, Peter, I'll just call everyone to Emily Rogalski's work. She's a professor here at the University of Chicago. She looks at superaging, and it's the subset of individuals that she finds when, as a neurosurgeon, she looks in and she sees that they actually have the same brain power cognitively as people in their 50s typically. And how do they get there? And she does a lot of research around it, but it just calls out that aging and cognitive are not linear. And they have correlations, but there are many people that continue to thrive and be as ready, intuitively than they were, earlier, and grow in some of those domains. Okay, I've got a few more questions. We'll make these power round because I know we're coming to the end of our time. We have a question here from Vina. Is there a policy solution possible in the US to workplace ageism that might be superior to each individual advocating with HR by themselves, considering that employers generally have the upper hand with at-will employment? I will add to that, Peter, a curiosity I've had, which is there are a number of companies that somehow have mandatory retirement ages. Those mandatory retirement ages have not changed, even though the health span of individuals have scientifically changed, meaning that we know people are living longer. We know that they're experiencing health and acuity longer. And it would seem to me, we're both trained as lawyers. Neither of us practice, so we're obviously not very good at it. But it would seem to me that there's something there that could be potentially done, because the origin of those mandatory retirement ages is that there was a relationship between aging and the ability to perform a certain job. And theoretically, if we've had huge advances in science and health, there would have to be a natural change, at least in that number that is decided upon. But yeah, what are your thoughts on how we think about this from an HR perspective?
Seth, I have a lot of thoughts on this particular topic. As a recovering Washingtonian, I can tell you a couple of things that we'd love to advocate for. First, we're hearing a lot about the incoming administration creating some sort of deportation czar. How about scratching that and just creating an aging czar? How about looking at all our federal policies holistically and recognizing that investing in young entrepreneurs is great, but if you invest in older entrepreneurs, you'll likely get greater return on your investment. How about if we realize that Social Security and Medicare aren't the only things that define us as we age? How about we look to investing in lifelong learning institutions like yours? And finally, on the ageism question, there's actually a couple of real examples out there. First, there's an age discrimination statute on the books. The problem is that when you go to prove it, you have to basically have a smoking gun to prove it. Oh, and by the way, that changes depending on how old you are. So there's a fix that's ready. In fact, former Senator Kamala Harris, or the vice president rather, had such a proposal. Similarly, there's a legislative proposal with the abbreviation POWADA, P-O-W-A-D-A, which is basically an anti-discrimination update. So there's real ways we could change the way we are impacted with ageism in the workplace. Not to mention what you just said, Seth, is just ban mandatory retirement ages. Just ban it. Ban it.
Well, you mentioned investment and that we're not always thinking about the experienced leaders. And so here is a comment from someone who is a competitive swimmer, also a startup founder at 63 years old. The startup has scaled significantly and turned profitable this year. Yet for some reason, VCs are giving the cold shoulder. He says, I assume that if I were 20 years younger, they would be fighting to get in the door. Do you know if there's data on this issue of investment and how it looks at the ages of different founders? Is there anything that's been done empirically, Peter, on that front that kind of gives us an understanding of where ageism may enter into this?
Not off the top of my head, which is unfortunate. And that is a great idea for an aging foundation to fund, I think. But anecdotally, I can tell you, because as a foundation, we not only do grant making, but we also do impact investing. So we use the rest of the endowment and invest in things like venture funds. And so we demand of our funds to demonstrate the ages of their startups that they're investing in, the founders' ages. Who are they helping? Are they helping dual eligibles, for example? All sorts of things we're doing to sort of hold people's feet to the fire, to hold them accountable, that we're walking the walk and talking the talk. We want you to be age diverse, because guess what? There is science on what I said earlier about older founders succeeding in exits faster and bigger than younger founders.
Final question, Julie Kaufman asked, can you give us some practical info on age tech? Anything you want to share as someone who knows what may be coming in the future on this front?
Yeah, sure. So by practical info, if you mean where can I get the latest gadget, I would encourage you to look at two places. The first is the Consumer Technology Association's foundation. They are the leaders of getting the industry, the technology industry, thinking about aging. And if you navigate their website or you attend CES and look at their startup competitions, they have something called Eureka Park, E-U-R-E-K-A. And they have all sorts of cool inventions and products that are out there. Just early, if you're an early adopter and want to experiment, great place to go. The other place to go, AARP has actually invested a large sum of money in developing the age tech ecosystem. So they are bringing together the Best Buys of the world with the great inventors of the world and forcing them through AARP's, let's say, advice and counsel to create products that will resonate with older adults. They have something called Age Tech Collaborative. Take a look at their site as well. And they have loads of companies that are willing to work with you.
Well, Peter, this has been a fascinating conversation. We're very grateful for your taking the time. We're grateful as well for what you're doing as a leader in this field to try to embrace the power of longevity. Thank you all for joining us. Let me encourage you to consider joining us again on Monday. Daniel Levitin is a neuroscientist who looks deeply at many of the things that came up here and will be able to provide the experimental basis of how we know many of the beliefs that we talked about. Thank you all and enjoy the rest of your Thursday. Thanks again, Peter.
Thank you, Seth.